right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Housing Forward Massachusetts conversation with BPDA Director Brian Golden. We are just going to give folks another minute to join. We've got a lot of interest in this event and excited for this conversation. We will kick it off in just a minute. Okay, 12:04. We've got a great attendance here, so I will get us started. My name is Josh Zakim. I am the Executive Director of Housing Forward Massachusetts. I want to thank you all for taking time to join us for our unfortunately virtual instead of live conversation with BPDA Director Brian Golden. Brian and I had the privilege of working with Brian in my prior role in the Boston City Council. I want to thank him for participating and joining us today. I'm going to just quickly go over a couple items, some housekeeping as we get started. One, we are going to have, conversation. Brian and I are going to chat a little bit about housing production, development in the city and beyond. As all of you know, Housing Forward is a nonprofit research and advocacy organization dedicated to supporting pro-housing efforts, increasing the housing supply across Massachusetts through advocacy, regulatory reform, things of that nature. We are going to also have a live Q&A towards the end of this. I want to point out that one, if you want to ask questions anonymously, you can message them. We'll ask everyone to message all of their questions to either me or Kendall Feynman, who are listed as hosts of this meeting. And then we will sort of call on folks. And if they want to ask them live, ask them live. If for whatever reason you want to remain anonymous, Kendall and I will ask the questions for you. Having said that, I also want to recognize that we've been joined by State Representative John Rogers. I want to thank you, Rep, for being here on this call. Rep Rogers is Vice Chair of the Housing Committee in the state legislature, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us, Representative Rogers. With that, I want to turn it over. Oh, and everyone should know this is being recorded and will be posted on our website for the future. With having said that, Brian, again, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. If you could sort of maybe kick things off by just giving us a little background on yourself. You've been at the BPDA for some time now. I've seen a lot of change there, and would love if you can frame this in the housing production. What are some of the challenges that you see for Boston and the surrounding area, and what are some potential solutions? And then we can get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty.
So first of all, thanks, Josh. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for your interest and the interest of all the attendees. It would have been nice to visit in person. I thought this was going to be the first big gathering that I participated in for 18 months. But that apparently is a decision deferred. I look forward to that happening before long. But we've learned to master, I think, the art of conversing through virtual means, and I welcome the opportunity to share what's going on in my world and in the BPDA's world, and hopefully glean some important opinions and suggestions about ways forward, given this important sort of political transition we're in the midst of. So I've been here for 13 years, Josh. I was in a senior post for the first 4.5. I've been director for almost 8. And I didn't expect this to happen. I didn't intend for this to happen, but I held this job longer than anybody since the origins of the organization in 1957. The next closest was Steve Coyle, who had the job for 7.5 years, but I passed that mark a few months ago. But it's been a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful time to be doing this job. But for the disaster of the COVID economy and COVID society of the past 18 months, this was a great time to have this job. We've gone through the biggest building boom in the history of the city. We're almost 400 years old. There's never been a 7-8 year period like this where so much was permitted, so much has been built. It's over 90 million square feet permitted since early 2014. For a long time, that was mostly characterized as a housing boom. And it, in more recent years, began to diversify a bit more commercial, more lab, more institutional, but disproportionately housing for a long time, which is really good news, right? We need the production. And if you look at a graph at the creation of new units, from 1950 forward, it was relatively flat through the end of the 1980s. We saw an uptick in 1990s, and then in the post 2010 period, really is where we've seen it really take off, and most aggressively post 2013. So not only has that meant a whole lot of new housing production since 2014, we've permitted almost 50,000 new units of housing. Over 30,000 of those units have been built. And really good news when we consider that we want everyone all along the socioeconomic spectrum to benefit from that, that 22% of what we've approved has been income restricted housing. So several thousand new units of housing for people in that sort of middle workforce dynamic that we talk a lot about, and in lower income levels. So working to harness market forces, a very positive development climate, to develop not just market units, but to develop units for people all across the socioeconomic spectrum. And we've had a really good story to tell, good results over the past 7 or 8 years. The trick is keeping it going and really building on it.
That's a phenomenal statistic, and I wasn't aware it was quite that high. That nearly a quarter of new housing has been income restricted. What do you see? We talk about, and the Walsh administration and your agency, obviously in particular, has talked a lot about the need for more housing, and the number we've seen a lot of is 69,000 units of new housing by 2030 to meet demand, the growing demand. I mean, we just got the census numbers back. Boston's population has grown almost 60,000 in the last 10 years, which is good, but also presents some challenges when it comes to housing, this growing population at all income levels. What is your take on the pace of this growth in the housing in particular? Obviously, I know the BPDA oversees development, industrial, commercial, office, et cetera, but for housing, how are we going to hit that number? And do you still think that 69,000 unit goal is where we are? Or is it gotten bigger? Has it gotten smaller?
So I'm going to be as careful as I can, just because we're about to get a new mayor, whoever that may be. So I want to be sensitive to what kind of direction the new mayor may want to provide, what kind of goals the new mayor might want to set. So I don't want to prejudge outcomes, but just looking at it more retrospectively, that 69,000 number that Mayor Walsh announced several years ago, not only was it completely reasonable, it looks like we will attain that and pass it well before 2030. I mean, we've got 48,000 units already permitted in our process. Not all of them have been built yet, but about 35,000 of them have been built. And so it looks like with 9 years to go, we're going to hit that 69,000 with ease. The real challenge is what is the next most reasonable number after that? I personally would argue that we should be able to accommodate an increased number of units. Again, we had multiple decades with almost no production, and we're making up for that. At the same time, we're dealing with a population increase, as you mentioned, Josh, that is bigger annually than any kind of population boom we've had. Last time we saw numbers like this annually was post-World War I. Post-World War II, the population slid as the suburbanization of America took hold. But it was post-World War I where we saw numbers like that, 8, 9, 10,000 people a year. Well, we were back to that for several years before COVID. Now, COVID did stall it, not surprising to anybody. People just are not migrating much or changing residences or changing cities the way they would have in the prior 7 years. But we would expect with COVID hopefully sooner rather than later receding as a threat, that we would see a restoration of that migration into Boston. We think it's a healthy thing. It's good for the people who already live here, obviously good for the people who are moving here, otherwise they wouldn't be coming here. They're chasing jobs, some of them in the sophisticated boom industry of life sciences. We are now the most significant life sciences cluster on Earth. And we want to nurture that, not just for the good of the city, not just for the good of people, at all of the income levels in the city, but also for the good of humanity. The life sciences finding a home here and being able to build, develop, create jobs, and create cures for the things that vex, humankind is a really important and good thing. So we embrace that. We look forward to sort of positive population growth, and with that, an increase in the number of units. We've been working really hard, especially once Mayor Walsh arrived, called upon us to come up with a citywide general plan, which we called Imagine Boston 2030. It was adopted by our board in 2030. It remains sort of our touchstone for a macro direction forward. And in that document, we called out the need to identify key strategic corridors, preferably TOD, near mass transit, get people out of cars, walking, using mass transit. And that's where we would concentrate a lot of this development. We still think that's very sound reasoning. And we've done a series of strategic plans throughout the city, taking our lead from Imagine Boston 2030 to sort of prepare the terrain for significant density in appropriate locations.
That's great. And going off that about the plan and the planning process that your agency has conducted, something we asked all the mayoral candidates back when there were 5 of them, when we had a series of discussions like this, is what about codifying that into the zoning? That, the guidelines are obviously helpful, but, from a predictability standpoint for neighbors and developers, how do we do that? Is that something that's in the works to put into the actual zoning code?
So thanks for cutting to the chase within the first 15 minutes, Josh, because that is, for my own selfish wants and needs out of this conversation, is to encourage those who are listening and the constituencies that you represent are otherwise involved in. We need people who support these planning studies that call for significant density, that call for significant new units of housing, and in some cases life sciences and institutional expansion as a means of job creation. We need advocates for these things, and we have had. This is no surprise to anyone. We've had trouble getting these from guideline stage to zoning. We've done a few of them. Stewart Street planning study that was codified into zoning early in the Walsh administration. South Huntington Ave, very discrete, piece of geography, but which did yield some significant new development over there. Harrison, Albany, that goes back to the tail end of Mayor Menino's administration. Guest Street over in Alston-Bright in the New Balance campus. We have had some luck. Good fortune with developing the consensus to support the guidelines and then support converting them into new zoning. Where we've really struggled recently, Western Avenue in Alston. We get about 5 million square feet of development proposed there right now. And when I say Western Avenue, I'm really talking about a little more than Western Avenue, but not much. You go to the end of Western Avenue, heading toward Watertown, you bang a left, you're on Leo Birmingham Parkway. A whole lot of residential development proposed and actually approved over there. There's some on Lincoln Street, which runs right parallel to the Pike. Some really significant activity there. We've had a lot of difficulty getting that across the finish line, just in guideline form, never mind zoning. Same with Dot Ave. Between Andrew Station and Broadway, we think that is the perfect strategic corridor for new job creation, new residential. You've got 2 red line stops on either end of it. And again, what's there today cries out for change. That place should go through a metamorphosis. We did get those to guideline stage. The board adopted those as guideline. Once we begin the process of trying to move to zoning, some significant opposition emerge, and we're still struggling with that. And so there's a variety of places like that that have been difficult to get guideline buy-in and then ultimately zoning. We need advocates for these things, and there's no question that for the most part, when we talk significant new density and in some cases significant new height associated with it, boy, we kick a hornet's nest, and it's a real struggle. I remain convinced that what we are attempting to do here is really important for the long-term well-being of the city, but overcoming this, the opposition associated with that kind of disruption, that kind of density, that kind of height, people recoil initially, and maybe even for a prolonged period of time, and we need help settling that down so that we can, frankly, do the upzoning.
Yeah, but I think that's critical. And that's something, I often heard when I was a city councilor from constituents that they wanted that predictability of rezoning, so that it wasn't every time a project was, being proposed that they would have an IAG or whatever and go through essentially over and over again. I'm not going to call it spot zoning because that's a bit more of a technical term, but it felt like that. And so I am glad to hear your take on that. And I know from folks in the industry, builders, would love that predictability as well when they're, planning, when they're investing, when they're building, particularly around housing. And that's sort of leads into my next question. And it's a bit of a big question, so feel free to restrict your answer. But what do you see as the biggest obstacles in the city or regionally to constructing new housing, whether it's workforce housing, low-income housing, luxury housing? What are the biggest obstacles? Are they regulatory, political? Is it economic? What do you see in that in your experience?
So it's all of those things. And if I had to rank order them at the moment, I'm not exactly sure what I do, but I'd say, clearly the politics of radical alterations in the built environment are unsettling to people, and it takes a while for folks to settle down and embrace it. But it requires us not to just throw our hands up and run away. We have just got to keep coming back at it and explaining that the well-being of a neighborhood, the amenities and the benefits, the infrastructure that people might be pining away for requires a means of supporting those efforts. And very often it's development. We talk about downtown and resiliency and combating sea level rise and climate change. We need development downtown to help create some of the physical interventions that are going to be necessary to allow Boston to cope with, 36 inches of new sea level rise by 2070 and closer to 5 feet by the end of the century. We need development to help us address some of our physical needs, the physical interventions that people want. But this is that old line, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. So nobody wants to pay a price. I don't want the height, I don't want the density, I don't want change, but I want all these things. We've got to keep making the argument. And why I'm kind of optimistic about this, usually, if you just look at, how the conversation I led with, 90 million square feet has been permitted. We're not pinned down having a bunch of whole nothing accomplished. Things are getting accomplished. We're getting things permitted, and those things are getting built. There's 90 million square feet permitted. About 60 million of it has been built in the past 7 or 8 years. Big things are getting done. You can get there with communities. You can get there with constituencies, but it requires iterative process over and over again, listening, being empathetic, and using that empathy to come up with meaningful responses. So it's that, the disruption in the built environment, people in a more practical sense, very concerned about congestion. Height and density means congestion. So you got to come up with really good transportation solutions, transportation arguments on congestion. And I think, we just did a couple of studies over at Dot we did a transportation study to support the planning guidelines, just did it in Western Avenue too, did it for all of Alston Brighton. It was an Alston Brighton transportation study. And the goal there is, where are the choke points? Where are the really key problems? And making sure that we're convincing the neighborhood, hey, as development comes, there's a menu of options here now in the Alston Brighton transportation study, and that development's going to pay for fixes there. Making sure people understand that there are solutions to the things that concern them. So there's that. But again, so it's it's culturally and the political culture disrupting built environment, then transportation, very legitimate concern with a growing city like this, and but also money. How do we get buy-in? Because really what we run into trouble is this: if you're going to do significant market rate, and I accept that we need significant market rate housing for lots of good reasons, but you especially need it to help subsidize the income restricted stock. And so getting the density you need to address the neighborhood's demands for affordability, that's a real trick. So that is the economic piece of it. How do you get those competing goals harmonized in a way that gets
well, it's a challenge, and it often gets lost, I think, in some of that community conversation is as how we're gonna pay for affordable units, mixed income projects. It leads me to another question. You formerly a state representative, so you have some insight into the state process. Is there anything that the state can do that you think, aside from direct subsidy for more affordable housing, which I think everyone wants to see more of? Obviously, housing choice legislation was enacted earlier this year. It doesn't impact Boston directly. It's helping regionally. Are there other things around zoning, around we've seen other states do things like that, requiring upzoning, more projects as of right statewide, or other changes to the process that you think the state could help with to encourage more housing production?
Yeah, there's no question. And, it's great to see my friend and former colleague, John Rogers, on the call, because he's really in the eye of the storm as far as a macro state approach to this. But making it easier to get significant things done, i.e. multifamily housing in suburbia, is a hot button issue. And the governor, to his credit, has also been working in a really determined fashion to see if there's something we can do with regard to statewide policy that allows us to jumpstart some production in the suburbs. Mayor Walsh also signed on to the Metro Mayors Coalition, which calls for, I think, 185,000 units of new housing. Now, no real mandates there, right? It's a whole bunch of mayors agreeing to play their part in production. And I do think, like, some people would look at that and say, oh, there's a bunch of words. Where is the sort of implement, the reliable tool that requires that desired outcome? And the reality is, I think by putting themselves out there and saying they will do their part, they've sort of put themselves on the spot, and I salute them for it. Once you say you're going to do it as an elected, you really are going to bring a lot of grief on yourself if you don't follow through. So I am hopeful that the bully pulpit of mayors, or the bully pulpit of others, calling the mayors out and saying, no, you said you would create 20,000 new units to help in this goal of 180,000. So I think that sort of soft approach mixed with a more, potential black letter law approach at the state house could pay some dividends. But the reality is, and we accept this, look, we are the biggest city in New England. We're the economic engine of New England. We think we are well suited to deal with density in many places, because let's face it, mass transit is more intensively present in the city. So we will shoulder a really significant piece of this requirement, but man, we'll never get near addressing the regional need if others don't really step up. But you do see some interesting things going on when it comes to density in some of the suburbs. Now, Newton is one of the biggest suburbs, almost 100,000 people, but there's been some pretty bold moves there to create some significant new housing stock near mass transit and other TOD facilities.
Well, I think that's critical. And you're right, the Metro Mayor's Compact is important, but holding people to those commitments is equally important. And I think Boston is, listen, everyone can always do better, but Boston is doing a lot on housing production, on carrying the weight, as you said, as the city should, given its size. But it is a regional issue, and it's interesting to hear that take. And we're active as an organization in some of these other communities as well, advocating and working with them on some upzoning and things like that to make it easier and more predictable for people to do that, to build that necessary housing. And as I'm sure you're familiar with, given the state law restrictions on cities and towns when it comes to municipal finances, we are very dependent on that new development of all types when it comes to closing budget gaps, as we saw about 12 or 13 years ago when Mayor Menino was in office, and we're at risk of closing libraries, things of that nature. So it's important we continue pushing forward on that.
And to your point, Josh, there's an old line we use around this place all the time. Great cities aren't born, they're made. And it's the result of deliberate, intentional choices, and healthy, intentional, deliberate choices, can bear really good results, but there can also be really bad policies embraced that are counter to the greater good that I think we all aspire to. So, I'm old enough now to remember, really, you talk about the 12 or 13 year ago contraction in city revenue in response to the Great Recession of 2008. It bore no resemblance to what we saw in the wake of the passage of Prop 2.5 in 1978. There's a big giant development over here at the Government Center Garage, which was a city garage, sold off to deal with some of the economic difficulties that were imposed on the city as a result of that constriction on revenue. 89 to 92, that recession was a horror show. 2008 was child's play compared to the 89 to 92. So macroeconomic forces can have a really significant adverse impact, but so can choices made, policy choices made that are counter to sort of the goals that this agency has historically aspired to. Let's face it, since 1957, the Planning Development Agency and its predecessor in name, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, have been a pro-growth and fundamentally a pro-density organization. And I think the product has been a good one. I think the outcome of the efforts has been more good than bad, certainly some bad, but more good than bad. It helped create the Boston of the 21st century that we fundamentally love. But we have to be vigilant about the things that will pay dividends for all the people of Boston, as well as those who we expect to come here.
Thank you. I see we've got a bunch of questions already lined up, so I'm going to go unmute Barry Bluestone, who is our board chair. Give him the first question, which he sent in. Barry, unless you want me to just read what you sent.
Oh, I'm fine. Let me say hello. Brian, so good to have you here today.
Hi, Barry.
One of the things that we know so well, and I know it better than most, having spent 50 years in universities, is that we've had a huge increase in our graduate student population, a very large increase in young professionals coming here in the health sciences, the hospitals, biotech, financial services. Is there some way the city and perhaps the mayors combined in the region can reach out to these institutions and see what role they could play in helping build some of the housing using presumably private developers, not just for their undergraduate students, which we've done pretty well on, but for the graduate students, which is the largest growing population of young people in the city and the region. So is there some way to work with them more closely in the way that we work pretty closely with them when we ask them to build undergraduate residence halls?
So, Barry, if you had specific suggestions about doing what we should be doing that we're not, we'd certainly be all ears. And we think about this constantly because there are 30 colleges and universities within the political boundaries of the city. I mean, I must admit, I usually peter out after the first 15, but But when you see the list, you're like, oh boy, I forgot about that one, that one, that one. Some of them are quite small. But there are 30 colleges and universities in the city. There's about 150,000 people going to some institution of higher ed in the city. That is enormous. Now, all of those 150 don't live in the city, but a disproportionate share sure do. And we use the IMP process, our institutional master planning process, to essentially negotiate important benefits for the city to address, whether it's demographic needs or recreational needs, facilities that serve the community, and, for instance, tutoring. There's a whole lot of human services type benefits, as well as bricks and mortar benefits, that we expect those IMPs to yield. And I think if you went IMP by IMP through the 30 of them, I don't know if the square footage requirements are satisfied by all 30, but I think most do have an IMP. There are some triggers. You'd be impressed at how much we attempt to extract out of the schools with regard to housing creation above and beyond just the undergrad population. Because you're right, the obsession is undergrad, because undergrads in neighborhoods, whether it's my neighborhood of Alston or Mission Hill, or you name it, that's what really gets people's dander up. But I think there's been some really creative things done about housing creation above and beyond that undergraduate community. And we spend a lot of time, not just the agency, we have the IMP authority and responsibility, but D&D, the Department of Neighborhood Development, works very closely on these issues, Sheila Dillon, to get students out of neighborhoods and into university-owned, university-controlled facilities.
If I just may follow up, we in Housing Partners and some of the other organizations here, if you can come up with some ways that we might be able to help encourage that and work with your department, I'm sure there are a number of us on this video who would love to help.
So I will just whet your appetite a bit. We got a really interesting one sort of percolating associated with one of the major universities, and I'm kind of hoping that's a proof of concept that can be that can be expanded upon by other schools. But I think we'll have something interesting to talk about pretty soon in that regard.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you, Barry. And our next question is from Richard Giordano. Rich, I'm going to unmute you and let you, I guess you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Josh, for hosting this, and for Director Golden for coming on and being open to taking questions. Rich Giordano from Fenway Community Development Corporation. I'm sure you know the stats better than all of us. For those who don't know, we have about 4 million square feet of lab space being proposed for development in the Fenway within 4 major projects from John Rosenthal, the Red Sox, IQHQ, and Samuels. And individually, they're all responding to the needs of the market, and we understand that. And my question really is, what can we all do to build the rest of the stuff that we need to deal with that? My rough calculation was those 4 million square feet of lab space and a little bit of housing will create at least 10,000 jobs. And so the question becomes, how do we get other folks, all those developers, to collaborate with everyone else to build the necessary housing? And how do we figure out how to get those workers in and out without taking cars? Because as we all know, the Fenway, especially on game day and event days, can be a madhouse. So, we got a problem of riches, in the sense that we got these guys doing this amazing development, but how do we get everybody at the table to also do the housing and the transit work that we need, and for that matter, the affordable daycare that we all need to make that 4 million square feet of lab space, really work for the benefit of everybody?
So we struggle with that every day here, because while we're still doing a lot of permitting of housing, we're not doing much commercial office space at all. but we are doing a lot of Article 80, our permitting power under the zoning code, a lot of Article 80 on labs and life sciences. And Rich, this is the proverbial, fixing the airplane engine while the plane's in flight. It's tricky because we don't want to lose these opportunities to once again ensconce Boston as the most significant life science cluster on earth. We really want to seize this opportunity for the good of the city, for the good of humanity. But this is coming at us very quickly. If you and I were having this conversation even 5 years ago, we probably wouldn't be talking much about life science. This is the mass of it is sudden and recent. So we are struggling with this on a project by project basis, on a strategic planning corridor by strategic planning corridor basis, but even in a much more macro generalized sense. Where does life science belong? Where do labs belong? And the massive floor plates associated with those labs. From a design standpoint, it's significant. You're parking these aircraft carriers on major drags, but when you get a whole bunch of them, side by side, boy, it not only sort of from a visual and aesthetic concern, do you have or view, do you have a problem? You have a problem logistically, people coming and going. So what you just articulated in the Fenway is exactly the dynamic on Western Avenue. It's 5 million over there, and most of it is lab. So it's working hand in hand with the city we've got strategic planning efforts underway that attempt to address the concerns you raise, which take their lead from Imagine Boston 2030. But we also have Go Boston, which is a joint endeavor of this agency and BTD. That's about bus rapid transit. That's about better pedestrian and routes and biking infrastructure. We're talking about knitting together a lot of these entities in to create a shuttle system similar to the LMA. Where would we be if there wasn't a shuttle system in the LMA? I shudder to think of how what that would look like, or how it would work or not work. So we're working all these things, but Go Boston's really important in everything we do here, particularly with regard to the labs, because they're employee intensive. And man, I'm telling you, at least every other day, I hear hue and cry over suburbanites who want to work in these labs, but the labs want to come to the city, and you're not taking mass transit from Lexington to get to the job on Soldiers Field Road or Western Avenue. These are real problems. They're legitimate concerns. We want the good things. We don't want the bad things, but it's up to us to work with the developers, and usually multiples in the same immediate geography, to come up with transit solutions that allow us to actually then turn around and sell the project to the neighborhood. And it's BRT, it's bike lanes, it's pedestrian, it's shuttles, and ideally some kind of proximity to mass transit. And very often these things, we have a high degree of confidence they're coming, but when they're not here yet, people say, well, I know you say there's going to be a new mass transit stop over there at West Station where the Turnpike toll booths are, but that's 10 years away. And what if you don't build it? We'll be living with 5 million square feet on Western Ave and no train station and no easy access to the Red Line at Harvard Square or Central Square. It's conveying a sense of confidence and convincing people that we see the need to get transit solutions right and transportation network solutions right too, in a way that they accept it and ultimately will support it, and the electeds come along with them. As everyone here knows, again, get back to my soapbox, it's almost unheard of. It may be unheard of. I'd really have to think. It's hard to say this has never happened, but boy, I don't recall many times, if any, where we've approved something without any elected support. There was no elected official supporting a development or a planning study or planning guidelines or an upzoning. I don't remember. And if there wasn't an elected, I bet there was a civic group. I mean, we had, I would say the ideal is electeds, civic group, rank and file residents who might not be associated with the civic group, show us, it's not exactly math. It's a question of art more than science, but show us the neighborhood support. And it can manifest itself in different ways, but boy, if we don't have a good narrative that is convincing and the developer doesn't, boy, you're going to have a hard time getting approval of the board because we're not going to have any clear support from the community articulated.
I think that's a critical point, Brian, about the community support and something that Housing Forward is working to do is making sure folks know where they can engage, where they can participate, and how, in our How to Be a Housing Advocate training, that sort of thing, to make sure it's more representative. As I'm sure there have been a lot of studies on who shows up to these meetings is not necessarily representative of the neighborhood of the city as a whole, but that's just me editorializing. We do have another question from Eleanor White, who is another one of our founding board members, and just a reminder to everyone else on here, please shoot me or Kendall Feynman a message if you do have a question you'd like to ask, and we'll call on you. We've got certainly time for a few more before the end of the hour. Eleanor.
Okay, thanks, Josh. And Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ron.
I've got two quick comments and a question. First comment, I live in Newton, and I very much appreciate your calling out Newton for the hard work the city has done to generate affordable housing. As you probably know, it's kind of a tricky community with a lot of opinions, not all of them in favor of housing, and I think it's done a great job.
I think you're right. Mayor Fuller, Eleanor, really, she's behaving differently. And I mean that in a very complimentary fashion. She's doing some big things there that are important for Newton and in the metro area.
Thanks. Second comment, I've been very happy to hear your comments about local participation and balancing that with the need for development. I will say, having worked in this field for over 50 years, I have never been involved in a project which, having overcome local opposition, doesn't have elected and appointed officials after the project is built all lobby to get their relatives in as tenants.
Mm-hmm.
So
Eleanor, I don't want to out this elected, but there was one very, very contentious. Boy, this was rough. It was really rough. And it may have been the only one I can think of. I don't remember having the overt support of any elected. I think we had some civic groups, but it was painful. I remember the conversations with Mayor Walsh about like the inability to close the deal with an elected. The primary elected opponent a couple of weeks ago told me, boy, am I glad you put that through over my opposition because I was wrong. It's a fantastic project. Boy, did that make me happy. I wish he had come to that realization so I could say, I don't know of one without an elected support. I think there was one, and after the fact, he recanted and said we did the right thing.
Well, that's my point exactly. So my question is, also having been in this for so long, I can't remember a recent opportunity like we've got now for public funding, both with ARPA funds and hopefully the reconciliation bill. I'm sure you all have done some thinking about how you'd like those funds to be directed. If you can share some of those ideas with us, that would be great.
Okay, you may be disappointed, not a lot of detail on that, other than to say that this building is really animated on that subject. And let's face it, I don't, no matter who the mayor is in November, because the mayor, I think most people on this call probably realize the mayor becomes the mayor the week after the election in all likelihood. It's right after the certification of results, which is usually about a week after election day. So we'll have a new mayor by, I'm sorry, they've already agreed, assuming certification occurs, they're gonna transfer power on November 16th. So no matter who the mayor is, they're going to want a piece of that federal largesse that will be flowing in one way or another, whether it's the 3.5 trillion or 2 trillion. That's really serious money above and beyond the infrastructure component of it. And this building is going to do the very best it can, including this agency, to position itself to take advantage of that with again, outside of the infrastructure, with a focus on housing production and housing production for people at all income levels. And we obviously have a really important figure who has a seat at the table. And I think Secretary Walsh is uniquely positioned and focused to make sure that Boston benefits from whatever comes. I think we all accept something's going to be passed, and that something's probably going to be quite large, and that there will be benefits that flow to Boston. Is it going to be a panacea? Absolutely not even vaguely. But look, we look to the state on occasion for assistance in getting the right things done. There's a variety of state funding sources that are pursued, especially with regard to the creation of affordable stock. But it's also, the BPDA owns a lot of land. We own several acres in Charlestown. I don't know what ends up happening. There's a community process underway. There's a planned Charlestown effort looking at Rutherford Ave. But we expect to put our remaining urban renewal parcels to work for the people of Boston. What specifically that looks like, how many units, the composition of those units, still to be determined. There's a public process underway, but there are still some significant opportunities to use public parcels to create significant numbers of units of housing stock, including income restricted affordable stock.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Lellen.
Well, I'll give folks last call if you have questions, but I have a couple follow-ups, Brian, as we have some time left. I guess the most important, in my view, is what do you see in the future, in the next year, 5 years of Boston? How are we going to continue, or what can people on this call, quite frankly, do to encourage increased production of housing, at all levels and all types? Obviously these days we have to caveat everything by we don't know who the mayor of Boston is going to be a month from now, which will obviously have a huge impact. But there are regional factors at play. There's the State House. What do you see happening here? What do you think people can and should be advocating for to create more housing, to ease some of these affordability concerns, to make the city and the region more livable for families at all income levels?
This comes full circle, Josh. The most important thing is advocacy, and not just project by project or planning corridor by planning corridor, but making the case. And I mean, there's a lot of intellectual firepower on this call, and people have been working this issue and related issues for a long time. But it's not just about housing. Do we need housing, and do I think more market rate units are necessary, more income restricted units necessary? Absolutely. But the development climate period, it remaining positive, is really key to the well-being of this city. In the past 7 years, we've added about $300 million to the city's property tax revenues. That's in a $3.5 billion operating budget. 300 million was conjured up and now is a permanent part of the revenue stream going forward because it's now in the base. But that is a creature of the past 7 years, $300 million. And we're adding about $70 million a year to city revenue from development that's being
taxed.
That's
recurring revenue too, which is important.
Yes, taxed for the first time and then recurring. So here's the $70 million new, and now it's in the base. And we've added to that every year for 7 years. Now it started out, I think in 14, 15, we were on 40, 50 million. Past 3 years, we've been in the 70s. That's the city's increment. That's the new revenue to the city that permits even modest growth in the operating budget that gives us the high quality of life that people appreciate about the city. So I don't mean for a minute, every time I talk about property tax, that's all you're doing. You want development for property taxes. Absolutely not. That is not what's going on here. We think development and new units of housing are good in creating a vital city and housing for people who need it. It's important on its own merits, but the benefits are also significant property tax increases every year, so significant increase in the property tax base for the city, which is dependent, more than 70% of its revenue comes from property taxes. OWD, the Office of Workforce Development, development pays through linkage for not just the creation of affordable housing, another affordable housing stream linkage, but also job training. We do about $15 million a year, $12 to $15 million a year in job training. 4,500 Bostonians, mostly low-income people of color, 4,500 a year benefit from job training, which funding of which is created through development. The jobs, there's, in the past 7 years, we've created 86,000 construction jobs and about 80,000 in the 70s. I think it's upper 70,000 jobs that are development related, but not construction. It's 150,000 people working to support their families. This, and that's just a smattering of the benefits. It's jobs, it's property taxes, it's housing, it's affordable housing. These things are really important in sort of taking it on holistically and looking at, can we look at the importance of all of those factors and continually articulate them so that we get political support, political consensus, and that the decision makers, frankly, in this building as well as the State House, essentially view it in Hippocratic Oath terms. Do no harm to this, because this is really important in addressing real human needs. So do no harm to this. Yes, are there still really serious challenges? No question, but be very, very careful, very judicious. This thing is delicate, and we've seen over the past several decades cities that did not get it right. Boston has been fundamentally getting it right. Still need to take the edge off this. We're still dealing fundamentally with a market-driven economy, and I think that has yielded a lot of good. But how do we take the edge off that market economy in a way that doesn't disrupt all the good that comes with the market economy? So that is the challenge. It's to advocate project by project. It's to advocate planning corridor by planning corridor, but also taking it on in a macro fashion. What are the big things that vex this city, and can we plug a pro-development narrative into addressing those concerns?
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank you for your work and service to the city. And want to acknowledge, obviously, you mentioned earlier, the longest serving director of the BRA/BPDA in Boston's history. Obviously left your fingerprints on a lot of the city. And I think you're right. I think it's generally been positive. The city is thriving. People want to, by evidence that so many people want to be here. And making sure that we continue to build in a thoughtful way that is going to create opportunities and places to live for people of all income levels, people who have grown up in this city, people who are coming to the city for opportunity is critical. And that's what our organization, Housing Forward, is really focused on. We want to support appointed and elected policymakers and policies that make it easier and quicker to construct housing at all levels, because we do think there's all the ancillary economic benefits, as you were talking about, Brian, of tax revenue, job creation, creating a more climate resilient community, but also about lowering the overall cost of housing in a very high cost market in the city of Boston. And we welcome, as Eleanor was mentioning, the ARPA. Well, there was already ARPA funds. The future, hopefully, trillions of dollars of spending out of Washington. It's going to be really incredible to do that. And I think, just before we conclude, and you touched on this a little bit of how we can support your efforts and how we can make sure that this continues. Is there anything in particular? You mentioned advocating for rezoning and codifying some of those plans. Are there other things that you would see for folks who want to be supportive?
So, no. This is we obsess so much about the need to get buy-in to the plans, because look, this organization has been, buffeted historically by the belief that development is in the driver's seat, right? The developer or the development always wins because that means, money, that means jobs, and planning takes the back seat. Mayor Walsh was really clear on day one. He wanted planning a co-equal. And in fact, when we renamed the organization, planning went first, Boston Planning and Development Agency, to assert the primacy of planning. Because look, if we're doing solid planning and upzoning, preparing the terra firma, preparing the geography, giving people a meaningful voice in the planning decisions that are occurring in their neighborhood, and buying into high density use, infrastructure conversations, that when the development comes along that actually populates that planning geography, we'll have an easier time of it. Easy is not a word I use much in this place, but it will be better suited to make the case if there was good planning efforts that went along with it. That remains our concern because we have spent 8 years doing really high quality planning, unprecedented, really. There hasn't been much like this. The sophisticated nature of it, with a very firm eye toward, in recent years, preceding COVID, preceding sort of the nation's great reckoning once again with issues of race and inequality and inequity. We've been working on this for a while, and we've got a whole lot, a suite of tools that we've been using in the neighborhoods to make sure that we were doing all our planning and all our development decision making through an equitable lens. I know that's a very commonly used phrase now, but we've been doing it for quite a few years. We have a DEI director that looks at the internal DEI issues of the organization and make sure that our efforts in the neighborhoods reflect good, sound DEI goals. We've got a language access plan. I'm really confident of this. There's no organization in America that has as sophisticated a language access plan as we do, with very often multiple translations occurring in our public processes at the same time from multiple different language groups, looking at the same project. So we've been working a lot of different issues in sort of a 21st century sensitive fashion to get buy-in to what we do. And the more we have attention paid to those things, not just the development, but the way we do things, that there is support and sort of an attempt to help us validate our methodologies, not just the project. We've had a pretty good run of it. We've got a lot of very positive media in the past couple of years on our DEI efforts as it relates to planning and development. But again, thought leaders calling attention to this, not being the BPDA of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and that it really does address the needs of Boston in all its diversity, racially, socioeconomically, income levels. It's really important. And I think, again, all of these come back to articulating support for development planning. But boy, I wanted to mention, we're doing a whole lot on transportation. We want BRT, we want more of it. There's still only 8 miles of BRT, bus rapid transit, in the city of Boston, 8 miles. The good news is almost all of it has occurred since 2014. So we're proud of that. But it's just a very small number of miles, and we need more of that. And to get more of that, we need to get buy-in in the neighborhoods to surrender curbside parking in some key places, because that's the only way in an old city you're going to get a BRT.
That's a very heavy lift in most neighborhoods, but no, it's encouraging that that's a priority, and I do want to thank you again, Brian, for your work and for joining us today. We are past the 1 o'clock hour. I know we could all talk about this all day, but I want to quickly just thank everyone again for tuning in, our supporters, folks who are interested, fellow advocates and board members. Thank you. This conversation will be posted on our website for folks who want to review it or share it with colleagues and friends. And certainly please take Brian's call to action to get involved in your neighborhoods, in your community meetings, in your civic groups. If we're going to solve some of these challenges, I think it's going to take all of us working. And Housing Forward at our website, housingforwardma.org, has a lot of resources for people who want to get more involved. Please participate, reach out with any questions. And again, thank you for joining us today. Have a great afternoon. Director Golden, thank you again for your time and for your work for the city of Boston.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to spend some time with you, and I hope we can do it in person before very long. But thanks for your interest.
Thank you all.